Good morning, students. Today is Monday, 29 March 2021. This will be our first and only lecture for this week, and the reason for that is that we have an exam on Thursday. Just a reminder, I know you're tired of hearing this, but I want to make sure you're in the loop. The exam is Thursday, the 1st of April, 3 days from now, and the exam, which is in Canvas, will be available between 8 in the morning and 8 in the evening on the 1st of April, Thursday. The exam itself is 1 hour, 15 minutes. So sometime in that 12-hour period, you must go in there. And once you get started, once you open up the exam, you have 75 minutes to complete it. So make sure you pace yourself. Make sure you've answered all of the questions. Don't leave anything unanswered. Even if you have to guess, you may guess correctly and it would be extra points for you. The exam coverage is listed on the reading list, which I'm turning to in my notebook. The exam will cover several sections of Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is entitled Problems for Act Utilitarianism, and here are the sections we covered. We covered the section entitled Supererogatory Actions. We covered the section entitled Promises, the section entitled Punishment, and the section entitled Problems About Justice. So we covered all of those sections from Chapter 4. We then moved on to Chapter 5. We covered only one section in that chapter. It was the first section. The title is Primitive Rule Utilitarianism. And the reason we covered just one section is to introduce you to this new type of utilitarianism. It's primitive or crude, yes, but it gives you the basic idea of this approach. We then moved on to Chapter 6, and although there are several sections in that chapter, we are covering only 3 of them. We covered what is egoism. In our most recent lecture, we covered some common misconceptions about egoism, and today we're going to cover the final section of Chapter 6, entitled The Refutation of Egoism. The Refutation. The format of the exam is the same as the first one you took, which means 10 true-false questions and 30 multiple-choice questions. The multiple-choice questions each have 4 possible choices, A through D, or in the case of a Canvas exam, there are no letters. You just have 4 choices. What else? Don't miss the exam. It's incredibly difficult for me to go in and make an exam available for one student. It's really absurd how difficult it is. So please, I'm giving you 12 hours. That's plenty of time, even if you're working full-time, to go in there and take 75 minutes to take the exam. When I go in to check the scores, I don't want to see 1 or more students who did not take the exam. Okay, that applies to you, each of you. I don't want to sound like a mean old SOB, but please be respectful of my time and make sure you take the exam. The date of the exam has been chosen from the beginning of the course. It's listed on the syllabus. It's on the reading list. Nothing has changed. You knew all along the exam would be on the 1st of April. So please go in and do it on that day. Okay, let's get started. This lecture won't take all that long. It's a fairly short section. We're going to see whether Feldman succeeds in refuting ethical egoism. So let's begin with a quick review. What is ethical egoism? Feldman has 3 different formulations in this chapter. He calls them E sub 1, E sub 2, and E sub 3. The second and third of those formulations are incorrect. Remember when we discussed act utilitarianism, Feldman discussed 9 different formulations. Only one of them was correct, and he called it U sub 7. That was the formulation that we tested, that we discussed. The correct formulation of ethical egoism is E sub 1. And let me read it to you. It's from page 84. E sub 1 says, quote, an act is morally right if and only if no alternative to that act has higher agent utility than it has. So there's a nice structural similarity between E sub 1 and U sub 7. Really, the only difference between them is that ethical egoism is trying to maximize agent utility rather than overall utility. So the only utility that matters to an ethical egoist is the agent's utility, which means the person performing the act. So you can think of agent utility as a subset of utility or overall utility. So let's get to the final section now that we have E sub 1 in mind. The title of this section is The Refutation of Egoism. So we need to understand what it means to refute something, such as a theory. To refute something means to disprove it, which also means to prove that it's false. So to refute X is to prove that X is false. X could be a claim. So sometimes we refute people's claims. If someone claimed that San Antonio is the capital of Texas, I would refute that by citing evidence to the contrary. Okay, that means I would have proved that claim false. If you refute a theory, you prove that the theory is false by providing evidence or arguments to that effect. So Feldman, in this section, claims to refute ethical egoism. Now, before we move on, we have discussed two theories up until now in the book. We've discussed act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. In both cases, we saw arguments designed to show that those theories are false. Did Feldman have a section in either of those chapters, in any of those chapters, entitled The Refutation of Act Utilitarianism or The Refutation of Rule Utilitarianism? The answer is no, he did not. So while Feldman provided arguments against those other theories, he never went so far as to claim that they refute those theories. He does make a bold claim with respect to ethical egoism. He thinks that he has come up with an argument that proves that it's a false account of right and wrong, that it's a false normative ethical theory. So let's see whether he's successful. And then we can wonder why he has not claimed to have refuted the other theories. Okay, I think I'm going to read, the section is quite short, and I think I'm going to read it and discuss it with you as we go along. So what I'll do is read a paragraph, and then I'll pause and spend some time discussing it, clarifying things, and then we'll move on to the next paragraph. So the whole thing shouldn't take more than about 20 minutes. Okay, so let's get started. I'm on page 95. Here's Feldman speaking. The most direct way to refute egoism, i.e. prove that it's false, is simply to point out some of its consequences. If we reflect on these consequences impartially, we will see that egoism is false. Now let me stop there for a moment. What does he mean if we reflect on these consequences impartially? You know by now that act utilitarianism requires that we be impartial. We can't be partial to ourselves or to our loved ones, to our friends, our family members, neighbors, colleagues, fellow countrymen and women. We have to be impartial if we're act utilitarians. Egoism does not require that. Egoism requires that we be partial. That's built into the theory. Agent utility is the utility of the agent, not of others. So when Feldman says, if we reflect on these consequences impartially, that can be interpreted as evaluating ethical egoism by a foreign standard, an alien standard. In fact, that's what philosophers call begging the question. If we evaluate ethical egoism using act utilitarianism's standard of impartiality, then of course it's going to fall short, right? Because ethical egoism requires partiality, not impartiality. So that's troubling. The fact that Feldman put that word impartially in there shows me that he's already biased against ethical egoism. He's evaluating it by a foreign or alien standard, one that's not endorsed by the ethical egoist at all. Okay, so let's bracket that, so let's set that aside and continue reading. Now, this case is important to Feldman's so-called refutation, so it's important that you understand all of the facts, and I will elaborate on some of them. Consider the following case. A man is the treasurer of a large pension fund. He is entrusted with the job of keeping track of and investing the money deposited by the workers. That's what a pension fund is. When a worker retires, the worker is entitled to draw a weekly sum from the fund. So that's what people live on once they retire, the money that they've been putting in and that's been invested into the pension fund. Suppose the treasurer discovers that it will be possible for him to use all the money for his own selfish pleasure without being caught. Perhaps he wants to buy a large yacht and sail to a South Sea island, there to live out his days in idleness, indulgence, and, you guessed it, procreation, and, in a word, enjoyment. So he's going to be living the life of sensuous pleasure, a hedonistic life of self-indulgence. Perhaps he wants to buy, I read that already. Since there is no extradition treaty between the South Sea Island and the United States, he can get away with it. Now, you've got to accept the facts as they're given to you. And so even though there are extradition treaties between different countries, we have to assume that there's no such treaty between this island nation, and the United States. If there were such a treaty, that would change things. Okay, so those are the basic facts of the situation. Now, Feldman is going to start elaborating in the next short paragraph, so let's read it. Let us also suppose that if the treasurer does abscond with the funds, hundreds of old people will be deprived of their pensions. They will be heartbroken to discover that instead of living comfortably on the money they had put into the pension fund, they will have to suffer the pain and indignity of poverty. They will be dependent on their friends and family and perhaps living on welfare for the rest of their lives because the money they saved up has been stolen by this treasurer of the pension fund. Okay, now let's start seeing what the consequences are of the various actions available to the pension fund treasurer. Feldman writes, we can now see the essentials of the case. The treasurer has two main alternatives. He can steal the money, or he can leave it where it is or where it belongs. Okay? Those are the two main actions, steal it or not steal it. In fact, those are the only two actions, right? Steal the money or not steal the money. The first alternative will be more beneficial to him, but it will be very harmful to the workers. The second alternative, which means leaving the money where it is, will be harmless. So his alternatives and their agent utilities are as follows. Feldman calls the two acts A sub 1 and A sub 2. Here they are. A sub 1, stealing the money. Feldman assigns an agent utility of that to that of plus 10,000. What that means is that if the treasurer performs that act, stealing the money, the treasurer will experience 10,000 hedons, right? 10,000 units of pleasure, right? A lot. No, it doesn't matter whether it's 10,000 or 100,000 or a million. It's a large positive quantity. So let's just arbitrarily plug in 10,000. The second act is leaving the money where it is. In other words, continuing doing your job as the treasurer and don't do anything to the money. Feldman assigns -3 to that because I suppose it's going to be frustrating on a day-to-day basis for the treasurer to realize that he didn't take the opportunity to steal the money. So the -3, I guess, represents frustration. Notice it's a much larger, it's a much smaller quantity of dollars than the hedons that the treasurer would experience if the treasurer performed act A sub 1. All right, we're almost done with the facts. Obviously, Feldman writes, A sub 1 has far higher agent utility than its alternative, A sub 2. E sub 1 is the view, which we just went over a few minutes ago, that an act is morally right if and only if it has at least as much agent utility as any alternative. So let's apply that theory, E sub 1, to this fact situation, this case, this hypothetical case. Feldman says, hence, E sub 1 entails that, or implies, that A sub 1 is morally right and A sub 2 is not morally right. You see why? Of the two actions available, one of them has more agent utility than the other, or at least as much as the other, and that makes it right according to E sub 1. The other act fails to satisfy that condition and is therefore not right. And of course, a synonym for not right is wrong. So of these two acts, A sub 1 is right, A sub 2 is wrong, according to the theory called ethical egoism. Now, Feldman is going to jump in and make a bold claim. He says at this point, this is clearly incorrect. So Feldman is judging that this result or this implication or this consequence is incorrect. Feldman is unwilling to accept that stealing the money is the right act and leaving it where it is the wrong act. Here's what Feldman says at the bottom of page 95. He says, for A sub 1 is not morally right. It is cruel and selfish. Thus, E sub 1 is not true. So Feldman is engaging in some criticism here. Feldman is making an argument to the effect that this theory is false. The argument involves showing that E sub 1 has an implication that is false or incorrect. And as you know by now, anything that has a false implication is itself false. That's what modus tollens says. Remember, modus tollens says if P, then Q. The second premise says Q is false. The conclusion is P is false. So what modus tollens says is anything such as P that has a false implication is itself false. And that's the conclusion. P is false or P is not true. So here's the argument put in modus tollens form, which should be familiar to you by now. We've seen several of these. The first premise is the if-then premise. Here it is. If E sub 1 is true, in other words, if ethical egoism is true, then, well, he left the word then out, but it's understood to be there. Then A sub 1, stealing the money in the example, is morally right. Okay? Feldman says that the theory implies that it's right for this man to steal the money. Okay, we're going to come back to that. Let's move on to the second premise. The second premise is somebody, the critic, coming in and saying, oh no, A sub 1, stealing the money, is not right. Right? The critic is saying, intuitively speaking, that is not the right thing to do. And maybe that's your reaction too. Right? When you read the facts of this case, you may have had a gut reaction, a gut feeling that that would be wrong to steal the money. Well, what follows from those two premises? The first premise says that ethical egoism implies that stealing the money is right. The second premise, which is our gut feeling speaking, says no, it's not right. The conclusion is ethical egoism is not true. Or we might just want to say it's false. Not true equals false. So this is an argument, according to Feldman, that disproves ethical egoism. That's another way of saying it proves that it's a false theory. Now, here's what's interesting. As I said a moment ago, there were many arguments like this against act utilitarianism. Do you remember the punishment objection and the promising objection? Remember the grandson case? Remember that case? The conclusion of that objection was that act utilitarianism, or U sub 7, is not true. Did Feldman say way back then that argument refutes act utilitarianism? Again, he did not say that. I wonder why. Why does an argument like this, of this form, why is it a refutation of one theory but not a refutation of some other theory? There's a kind of double standard at play here. And I'm trying to draw your attention to that. I'm accusing Feldman of being biased against ethical egoism. He has a very mild attitude toward the objections to act utilitarianism. In fact, he says, after discussing the promise case, the grandson case, he says something like, this is a problem for the theory. It may or may not be solvable by the act utilitarian. Well, that's a pretty mild criticism. If he said that here in connection with the pension case, he would have said something like this. This pension case poses a problem for ethical egoism. Whether the ethical egoist can solve that problem remains to be seen. So it's quite a different standard being employed here, isn't there? And I wonder why. I think many philosophers, such as Feldman, are indeed biased against ethical egoism. I wrote an essay a few years ago entitled Taking Egoism Seriously. And in that essay, I pointed out many examples of bias against ethical egoism. My claim in that article was not that ethical egoism is true or that you can prove it to be true. What I'm pleading for is just basic fairness. Let's evaluate ethical egoism by the same standards that we use to evaluate other theories like act utilitarianism. Let's not play favorites. Let's not pick on particular theories. There may well be good arguments against ethical egoism. I don't rule that out. But let's make sure that we apply the same standard to all the theories and not show favoritism toward some or bias toward others. So let's continue. We're almost done reading. Here's what Feldman says to conclude this section and this chapter. And once we're done reading it, we can then talk more about this objection and what the egoist might say in response to it. Here's Feldman. He says, this argument decisively refutes egoism. Now, that's even worse. Earlier, he's saying that this argument refutes egoism. Now it decisively refutes egoism. Now, the word decisive adds something. Imagine the basketball tournament's going on right now. Imagine someone saying, Abilene Christian beat the University of Texas, which did happen the other day, right? Abilene Christian University beat the University of Texas. Compare that to Abilene Christian decisively beat Texas. That adds something to it, doesn't it? I mean, you could win by 1 point, which would make it true that you beat that team, but you wouldn't say that you decisively beat that team if you won by 1 point. If you won by 20 points, maybe yes, you decisively beat or defeated that team. So Feldman is now saying that this argument decisively refutes egoism. So he's doubling down on this strong claim, this bold claim that he's making. And it gets worse. He says, this argument decisively refutes egoism, as do an enormous number of other arguments along the same lines. So this is just one of many arguments that could be given against ethical egoism. Any one of them, he's saying, decisively refutes that theory. Again, he didn't say anything like that when he was discussing act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism. He not only didn't say that a particular objection decisively refutes them, he never said that a particular objection refutes them. He was very kind of wavering and wishy-washy about those objections. All of that is out the window now. He's very bold, claiming decisively refutes. Our conclusion then, he says, is that egoism can be formulated in such a way as to be a consistent moral doctrine. Nevertheless, when so formulated, it simply is not true. Now, let me comment on that before we move on. In some of the sections that we didn't cover in Chapter 6, Feldman discusses, for example, an argument that egoism is not really a moral theory. It's something else. He also discusses the objection that ethical egoism leads to contradictory results or consequences. Here, he's admitting two things. He's saying ethical egoism can be formulated in such a way that it does not produce contradictory results. In other words, it's a consistent, coherent doctrine. And he's admitting that it is indeed a moral theory, a moral doctrine. Some people deny that, but Feldman says, I'm willing to concede that. So Feldman's criticism of ethical egoism is not that it isn't a moral theory at all. He admits that it is. His criticism is not that it leads to contradictory results. He admits that it doesn't do that. He says it's coherent, it's consistent. Feldman's criticism specifically is that it's false, right? The theory is false. It's not necessarily false, but it's actually false. And arguments like this one, he thinks, show that. He thinks that these arguments disprove or refute the theory. Now let me get back to my notes and show you how an egoist might reply to this objection. First of all, you know by now that there are two ways to reply to a modus tollens argument. So, suppose you are an ethical egoist. Maybe you're not, but you can imagine being one. What do you think is the strongest reply to this argument? Well, the two replies are always deny the first premise, which is called what? It's called grabbing or grasping the bull by the horn. Okay? The second strategy is to deny or reject the second premise. And you know what that's called, right? Biting the bullet. So the ethical egoist can avoid the conclusion of this argument, Proposition 3, by either rejecting the first premise or rejecting the second premise. Let's explore them. Let's start with biting the bullet. Notice that the conclusion of this argument is, the second premise of this argument is that stealing the money is wrong. Yeah, I paraphrased it just to simplify it. The second premise of this argument says that the treasurer's stealing the money is wrong. What would you be saying if you denied that? You would be saying that the treasurer's stealing the money is not wrong, which is the same as saying that the treasurer's stealing the money is right. Remember, right means permissible. So one strategy that can be adopted by the ethical egoist here is the same strategy employed by Bentham, the utilitarian. Remember when we discussed the too high for humanity objection? Jeremy Bentham's strategy was to deny the second premise, to bite the bullet. And so Bentham said that quantity is the only thing that matters as far as the rightness or wrongness of an act, the quantity of pleasure. For Bentham, the quality is irrelevant. Only the quantity matters. So Bentham got to bite the bullet. Bentham was allowed, so to speak, to deny the second premise. However painful that was for him, he did. Why can't the ethical egoist bite the bullet here and say stealing the money is right? Remember, biting the bullet means sticking with your theory no matter what the implications are. If you are convinced that ethical egoism is the correct theory of right and wrong, you may say to yourself, I don't care what the implications of it are, I'm going to accept them. Even if sometimes it makes it painful to me to accept them. Okay? That's biting the bullet. So one option available to the ethical egoist is to bite the bullet. Did Feldman discuss that? Absolutely not. He didn't mention that at all. And he does mention that elsewhere in the book as a possible reply to a modus tollens argument. But what I want to focus on is the strategy of grabbing the bull by the horn. That means denying or rejecting the first premise. So let's go back and look at the first premise. Here's the actual wording, and then I'm going to put it in a pithy way. The actual wording is, if E sub 1 is true, then, that word is understood. If E sub 1 is true, then stealing the money, the act of stealing the money in the example, is morally right. Okay? Let's put that in a pithy way. The first premise of this argument says, ethical egoism implies that stealing the money is the right thing to do. Could an ethical egoist deny that or reject that? Of course. The ethical egoist can say, no, my theory, ethical egoism, my theory does not have that implication. You, Feldman, misunderstand my theory if you think it has that implication. Remember, John Stuart Mill grabbed the bull by the horn over and over again. Remember that? John Stuart Mill grabbed the bull by the horn in connection with the doctrine of swine objection. He grabbed the bull by the horn in connection with the too high for humanity objection, and he grabbed the bull by the horn in connection with the lack of time objection. By the way, let me correct something. I just realized a moment ago I said that Bentham bit the bullet in connection with the too high for humanity objection. It was actually the doctrine of swine objection where Bentham bit the bullet. So that's my fault. I misstated it, but it's now corrected. Not that you're going to be tested on that again, but I want to set the record straight. It was the doctrine of swine objection where Mill grabbed the bull by the horn, Bentham bit the bullet. So the two great utilitarians diverged with their replies to that objection. And that shows you that act utilitarians often employ different strategies. Sometimes they grab the bull by the horn, sometimes they bite the bullet. And if act utilitarians get to adopt either of those two strategies, then surely an ethical egoist gets to adopt either of those two strategies. Feldman simply acts as though the egoist has nothing to say in response to this argument. In fact, he says nothing about it, does he? Feldman doesn't suggest at all how an ethical egoist might reply to this objection. So I'm doing it for him. I think the reason he didn't is because he's biased, right? He wants to wipe his hands of this theory. Feldman hates this theory, to be blunt. Many philosophers hate ethical egoism, and they resent even having to discuss it. So I would say to Feldman, look, you devoted a whole chapter of your book to this theory, and you discussed arguments in favor of it and against it, right? If you're going to discuss it at all, you've got to be fair to it. And fairness here in this final section means following up on the objection that you raised. What could an ethical egoist say in response to it? The ethical egoist can bite the bullet. We've already discussed that. Now we're discussing grabbing the bull by the horn. So what do you think is the best strategy, the best way to grab the bull by the horn? How might an ethical egoist plausibly claim that the theory does not actually imply that stealing the money is right? Well, the basic strategy is this. You need to find a way to show that Feldman didn't calculate the utilities correctly. He didn't do a proper calculation. He went way too fast in his calculation. Feldman said, for example, there's no extradition treaty. So if the treasurer makes it to the island, the treasurer is safe. The treasurer will never be apprehended or tried or convicted or punished. But wait a minute. Is that correct? Remember, the treasurer got on a yacht. There's going to be some time between leaving the United States in your yacht and arriving at the South Sea Island. It could be weeks, but maybe it's only days. Even if it were only hours, still there's a non-zero probability that between the time the treasurer left the United States and the time the treasurer arrived at the island, there's still a non-zero probability that the authorities will apprehend the treasurer, indict the treasurer, try the treasurer, convict the treasurer, and punish the treasurer. What would the punishment be if the treasurer were convicted of stealing huge sums of money in this way, embezzling money? That's a felony. Okay, that's called larceny. It's a felony. And it would be punished by a very long term of imprisonment, at least 20 years, maybe more. Is it in the long-term, rational self-interest of the treasurer to be languishing in prison for decades? Clearly not. Now, the probability of apprehension may be very small. So you've got to multiply the probability of apprehension, this tiny percentage, by the magnitude of the punishment, which, again, is quite high. So when you factor in the probability, however small it may be, of being punished for this theft, it may not be so clear that it maximizes agent utility. And there are other possibilities. For example, what if the family members of the pensioners from whom the money was stolen, the family members are going to be furious. Some of the pensioners themselves are going to be able and willing to go track down the treasurer. Even if the government of the United States does not act at all, what's to prevent the pensioners, the victims of the crime, and their families, or hired bounty hunters to track down and punish the treasurer? Right? Feldman doesn't discuss that at all. There's a non-zero probability that the treasurer will end up being punished by the family members, a kind of vigilante action. Okay? What about this? The islanders. What if the treasurer makes it to the island and starts living a lavish life? Won't the islanders be curious about it? Won't they wonder, who is this stranger? Where did he get all his money? If they do investigation, they may quickly learn, by reading the papers in the United States, they may learn that this person living on the hill in the mansion is, in all likelihood, the thief who stole the money. Do you think they're going to take kindly to a thief living in their midst? Mightn't the islanders mightn't they do something to harm the the treasurer for stealing the money? They may reason as follows. The treasurer is living high on the hog on stolen money. It would not be wrong of us to take that stolen money from the treasurer and use it for whatever purposes we have in mind, to alleviate poverty on the island, for example. Right? Imagine the noble use for the money. So when you start looking at all the bad consequences for the treasurer from stealing the money, the government could still find him and punish him before he gets to the island. The family members could track him down and exact revenge on him, kill him, torture him, forcibly take him back to the United States for trial. The islanders might react poorly to him once they learn how he got his money. After all, they don't want to be accused of harboring a fugitive. Think about it. If the islanders find out how he got his money, they're going to feel complicit in the theft. They're going to feel like, wait a minute, if we know that he stole the money and we do nothing about it and let him live the high life, the U.S. government and the family members and the pensioners are going to think we had something to do with it or that we're protecting him in some way. That will give them a motive to expose it, right? To bring it to the attention of the family members and the pensioners and maybe the U.S. government. So I would suggest to you that even if we stick to the facts as they're given to us by Feldman, there's a lot of room here to grab the bull by the horn, right? To deny the first premise. Is it really, really, really in an implication of this theory that stealing the money is the right thing to do? Which is another way of asking, is it really in the long-term rational self-interest of this man to steal that money? Arguably, the answer to that question is no. And if the answer to that question is no, then ethical egoism does not imply that it's right for him to steal that money. And that means the first premise of this argument is false, and that means that the argument is unsound. And therefore, Feldman is incorrect when he says that this argument refutes the theory. It does nothing of the sort. So Feldman went way too fast running through this, didn't he? He went way too fast. So he should have patiently broken it down the way I just did and asked whether it really is an implication of the theory that stealing the money is the right thing to do. In general, is it in your interest to steal money? In general, is it in your interest to harm people? In general, is it in your interest to cheat and lie, murder, and embezzle and things like that? I would suggest the answer is no. Here are some of the long-term adverse consequences of harming or exploiting other people. I have 6 of them. Number 1, criminal prosecution and punishment. If you think ethical egoism tells you to run out and steal, harm, murder, kidnap, rob, rape, and so on, if it gives you pleasure, think again, because all of those actions are felonies, severely punished by law. If you do any of those things, there's a non-zero probability, maybe even a high probability, that you will be apprehended and punished. Is it in your interest to be punished? Of course not. So an ethical egoist will, for the most part, abide by the law, obey the law, because breaking the law comes with great risks to your own happiness. That's number 1. Number 2, civil liability. When you harm or exploit other people, they can sue you for damages. That's not a criminal matter. It doesn't involve punishment. They can sue you and try to get their money back if money was taken, or they can get compensated for their injuries. Even if money wasn't taken, they can still get compensation by getting a civil judgment against the perpetrator. Now, is it in your interest to be sued for millions of dollars for harming somebody? Of course not. So you would be well advised not to go around harming and exploiting people. It's not only illegal and you could be punished for it, but you could be sued and have to disgorge huge amounts of money to the plaintiff in the legal action. Third, if you harm or exploit other people, you will develop a reputation for doing so. A reputation is represents your standing in the community. the word will get out if you harm or exploit others that you're a harmer or an exploiter. And other people will react to you accordingly. They will stop doing business with you. If you own a business, they'll stop frequenting your business, and you may have to go out of business because you no longer can make a profit. People will no longer befriend you once they learn how harmful your actions are and how exploitative they are. So your reputation will suffer. People will not engage in reciprocal actions with you. They will not trade with you, bargain with you, engage in commercial transactions with you, and so forth. Is that in your long-term best interest? All of the bad reputation and those things that flow from it? Again, the answer is obvious, no. Number 4, if you harm or exploit people, there's always the possibility of retaliation by the victim or friends or family of the victim. Okay? People don't take kindly to being harmed or exploited. They usually call the police, but even if they don't, they may sue you. And even if they don't sue you, they may go after you. And when they get hold of you, they're not going to be kind to you. They're going to pay you back. That's called retaliation or vengeance or revenge, whatever you want to call it. It's always possible. So if you think that ethical egoism says go out and harm people if you think it's in your best interest, or go out and exploit people, think again, because you run the risk of being retaliated against when you do things like that. Okay? An ethical egoist would take those things into account. 5th, ostracism. This is related to reputation, but you could be ostracized by the community. Once people learn of your behavior, your harmful or exploitative behavior, they will shun you or ostracize you. You will become an outcast in the community, what they call a pariah, P-A-R-I-A-H. Right? Is it in your interest to be shunned or cast out? Is it in your interest to be socially dead? I've heard the practice of shunning, which is used in certain communities, Amish, Mennonite, and so on. It's called social death, because once you are shunned, other people in the community refuse to even acknowledge your existence. If they see you outside on the street, they will turn their head like this, away from you. They won't interact with you, say hi to you, talk to you, do business with you, or anything. So it's a little bit like loss of reputation, but in some ways it's worse. You are living in a community, but with no interaction with anyone else. It can drive you mad. It's like dying. Not physically dying, but socially dying. And it won't surprise you that some members of communities where they're shunned leave. They leave the community. They strike out on their own and go live somewhere else and try to start over. But of course, that's harmful as well, right? To be uprooted, to go live among strangers and try to rebuild your life without any support systems or connections, that's very difficult. So it's not in your interest to be ostracized, and you're likely to be ostracized if you engage in harmful or exploitative acts toward other people. And finally, most people who are raised normally feel guilt and remorse when they do things that they believe to be wrong. Not everybody feels guilty. Some people don't think they did anything wrong. And if you don't think you did anything wrong, you won't feel the emotion of guilt or remorse. But people who do believe that they did something wrong typically feel guilty about it or remorseful about it. And that's an uncomfortable feeling. Feldman would call that those dolors, right? When you feel guilty or remorseful, that's a kind of pain that you're experiencing, right? It nags at you. It may debilitate you. It may interfere with your ability to do your job or to function in daily activities or to interact with other people in a healthy way. So one bad consequence of harming or exploiting others is that you'll feel guilty about it. You'll feel remorseful about it. And that has to be on the scale against performing those kinds of action. So when you put it all together, the theory of ethical egoism, which sounded at first like it said, if you can steal something or harm somebody and get something out of it, go ahead and do it. It does not at all say that. Remember, ethical egoism is an austere, strict theory. It requires that you look at the long term and not just the short term. It requires that you make enlightened decisions about what's in your best interest. And it requires that you be rational. Don't act on the basis of emotion or spur of the moment decision. Think it through in a rational way. And when you do, you will realize that many of the things like stealing money from pensioners, many of the actions like that are not in your long-term rational self-interest, either because of the possibility of criminal prosecution, civil suit, retaliation by the victim and the victim's friends and family, ostracism, loss of reputation, and guilt. When you put all that stuff on the scale, in all likelihood, it's going to turn out to be wrong to do things like steal money from people. Okay, one final comment before we end our discussion of ethical egoism. Let's change the facts a little bit. Suppose the treasurer, instead of being an ethical egoist, were an act utilitarian. So the treasurer realizes one day, you know what? There's a lot of money here that I can take and go to a South Sea island. I can then use that money not for my own pleasure, but to distribute to needy people on the island, for example, or elsewhere. Let's suppose it's on the island. Suppose this South Sea island is very poor and people are going without basic necessities. They're inadequately fed and clothed and housed. They have inadequate water, which could be corrected by spending money on an irrigation or water treatment facility. Suppose the treasurer, instead of acting selfishly, as in Feldman's example, suppose the treasurer is motivated by love of humanity. So the treasurer steals the money, goes to the South Sea island, where, according to Feldman's assumption, there's no extradition treaty, and the treasurer then spends the money not on himself, but on the islanders, and their standard of living rises dramatically. Couldn't that act be right according to act utilitarianism? Act utilitarianism says an act is right if and only if no other alternative to that act has higher overall utility than it has. If we fill in the details properly, it could turn out that stealing the money maximizes overall utility, in which case U sub 7 entails or implies what? That it's right. My question to you is, what would Feldman say about that? If Feldman is consistent, wouldn't he have to say that that argument refutes act utilitarianism? Decisively refutes act utilitarianism. It's the same example, except the treasurer used the money for the benefit of humanity rather than for himself. So here's the question. What would Feldman say about that example? Would Feldman say that the act is wrong, stealing the money is wrong because the pensioners were deprived of all their money? Or would Feldman say that the act is right because more good was done from stealing the money than harm was done by stealing it? In other words, however much the pensioners suffered, it was outweighed, vastly outweighed, by the good done for the islanders. So it seems that we have a case here where if we just tinker with the facts a little bit, even Feldman might say this objection decisively refutes act utilitarianism. I wonder why he didn't make that argument. I wonder why he didn't modify this situation and discuss it in the Act Utilitarianism chapters. And you're probably guessing that I'm making a point here, and I am, that Feldman is biased. He's biased against ethical egoism and perhaps in favor of Act Utilitarianism, because this example could have been modified very easily, and he would have to say the same thing about Act Utilitarianism. Okay, that's enough for this section and this chapter. There wasn't a lot in it, but it took almost an hour anyway. So don't forget the exam Thursday. This is the last you'll hear from me between now and then. Although I may send out an email on, let's say, Wednesday evening, just a reminder that the exam is the following day. But this is the last video you'll see from me before the exam. We're going to get started on the next reading on the reading list on the Tuesday following the exam. So please, before you watch my lecture the following week, read the first couple of sections of the next chapter so that you're prepared. So have a nice day. Good luck in your studying. And I will see you on the video about a week from today, Monday or Tuesday next week. And the exam again is Thursday. So long.